"I'll cook and clean for nothing," she said, rain running off her chin like she hadn't the strength left to wipe it away. "Just let me sleep in your barn. I won't eat much. I won't be any trouble at all." Beckett Lyle stood in his own doorway with the lamp guttering behind him, and looked at the woman on his porch step the way a man looks at a fence line washed out by flood, with the tired recognition that whatever came next was going to cost him. She was soaked through her thin coat, her boots split at the toe, and she was still standing straight as a fence post, chin up, like pride was the only dry thing left on her. "You got a name?" he asked. "Cora Ashford." "You got people, Miss Ashford?" "No," she said, and did not look away when she said it, though something in her throat moved like the word cost her. He should have sent her back down the road to town. Pawnee Bluff wasn't but 4 miles, and there were church women there who took in strays, or claimed to. But the sky had opened up an hour ago and hadn't let up, and his own wife had died in a bed not 30 feet from where he stood, and he still remembered, with a clarity that shamed him, how cold it was to be turned away from warmth. So he stepped back from the door instead of closing it. "Kitchen's warm," he said. "Come in before you catch your death standing there arguing about the barn." She hadn't expected kindness delivered so plainly, without a single soft word wrapped around it, and it undid her worse than cruelty would have. She came inside anyway, dripping onto his floorboards, and did not cry, because she had promised herself in the ditch outside town that she was done with crying, that tears hadn't kept her fed in 3 days and wouldn't start now. By lamplight he saw how thin she was, and how her hands, when she reached for the towel he handed her, shook with more than cold. "When did you eat last?" he asked. She considered lying. "Tuesday," she admitted, because lying to a man who just let her in out of a downpour felt like a worse sin than hunger. "It was Friday." He didn't say anything to that. He only turned to the stove, and within a quarter hour there was a plate in front of her with more food on it than she'd seen in a week, and he sat across the table and watched her eat like he was guarding something, though she couldn't have said what her, maybe, or the plate, or the fragile thing that had just walked into his house uninvited and refused to leave with her hunger unanswered. She had come from the Bell House, the boarding house on the east edge of Pawnee Bluff, where she'd scrubbed floors and hauled water since her father's fever took him the winter before last. Old Mrs. Dunmore had kept her on out of what Cora once mistook for kindness, until the day Mrs. Dunmore's nephew arrived to run the books, and decided a girl who ate and slept for wages she couldn't quite earn back in labor was a debt worth collecting. He'd put her out with a week's notice and no reference, and told the whole boarding house she'd been light-fingered with the silver, which was a lie, but lies traveled faster in that town than truth ever had. She had nowhere to go and no name left worth trusting, and so she had walked in the rain, out past the edge of everything she knew, until she came to a ranch gate with a lamp lit behind it. Beckett didn't ask her all of that the first night. He only told her there was a cot in the storeroom off the kitchen, dry and out of the wind, and that she could stay till the weather broke. The weather did not break for 11 days. By the end of the first week, she had scrubbed his kitchen to a shine it likely hadn't seen since his wife Sarah died 2 winters back, birthing a son who did not draw breath long enough to be given a name. Beckett didn't speak of it. Cora learned it instead from Emmett Sorrell, the old hand who'd worked the Lyle spread longer than Beckett had been alive, and who took to Cora's cooking the way a starving dog takes to a full dish, warily at first, then entirely. "He ain't been the same," Emmett told her one morning, working liniment into his knee at the table while she kneaded dough. Ranch was falling apart around him, and he didn't hardly notice. "You're the first thing that's made this kitchen smell like something besides dust in 2 years." Cora didn't answer that, because she'd learned answering such things aloud made them true in a way she wasn't ready for, and because she had troubles enough of her own to carry without borrowing his grief besides. But she noticed, the way a woman notices weather changing before the clouds admit it. She noticed the boy's cradle folded flat and pushed into a corner of the loft, still not given away. She noticed the way Beckett stood some mornings at the kitchen window before dawn, looking at nothing at all. She kept house without being asked twice, and mended what she found torn. And by the second week, she had put a curtain up in the kitchen window from a length of blue cloth she'd found in her own trunk, the last pretty thing she owned, because the room had needed color, and she had needed, badly, to give something back to a man who had given her shelter, without once asking what it would cost him. Beckett noticed the curtain before he noticed much else. He stood looking at it the evening he came in from doctoring a sick heifer, and something in his chest that had been shut up tight since Sarah's dying came loose half an inch, enough to ache. In the mornings that followed, he found himself lingering over the coffee she poured, rather than gulping it standing at the door the way he'd done since Sarah died, and he told himself it was only manners, though Emmett caught him at it more than once and said nothing, which was its own kind of teasing. Cora, for her part, found herself listening for his boots on the porch boards each evening before she'd admit to listening at all, and scolded herself for it in the same breath, because a woman without a roof of her own had no business measuring her days by another woman's homecoming. Never mind that Sarah Lyle was 2 years in the ground, and Beckett had never once, in all his grief, given Cora reason to think of him as anyone's husband but a dead woman's. It was Prudence Vane who reminded her of the distance still standing between wanting and having. She came calling on a bright, brittle afternoon, with a molasses pie balanced on one gloved arm and her father's buggy waiting at the gate. And she looked Cora over in the doorway the way a woman appraises a horse she has already decided not to buy. "You'll be the girl helping out," Prudence said, sailing past her into the front room without waiting to be asked. "Beckett, I've brought you a pie. I know how you've been managing since everything." Her eyes slid back toward the kitchen, toward Cora, standing there in her apron with flour on her hands. "It must be such a comfort to you, having someone to do for you, even if she isn't quite suitable in the town's eyes. I do hope you're not troubled by the talk." "I'm not troubled by talk that isn't true," Beckett said, taking the pie from her with less warmth than the gesture likely deserved. "Of course not." Prudence smiled the way women smile when they mean the opposite of their words. "Still, a man in your position ought to think of appearances. Papa says the bank does look kindly on a respectable household." She let that sit in the room a moment, sweet and pointed as the pie itself, before she took her leave. Cora said nothing until the buggy had rattled off down the lane, and then she set the molasses pie on the windowsill where the cat could get at it if it pleased her, and went back to her knitting with her jaw set hard. "You didn't have to let her in," she said finally, not looking up from the dough. "I didn't let her in. She came in the way she always does, like the house already belongs to her." Beckett stood in the doorway a long moment, watching her work the flour harder than the bread required. "You've no cause to mind what Prudence Vane thinks of you, Cora." "I've every cause. I've nothing to my name but what your charity affords me, and she knows it, and she's not wrong to see the difference between us." She looked up then, and there was more hurt in her face than she'd have liked him to see. "I'm not fool enough to mistake a warm kitchen for a place that's mine." "It could be yours," he said, before he'd thought the words all the way through, and then looked as startled by them as she was, and neither of them said anything further on the matter that evening, though it sat between them after that, warm and unresolved, like a coal banked for later. 2 nights later, unable to sleep for the wind rattling the shutters, Cora found Beckett sitting alone in the dark of the front room, a small carved wooden horse turning over and over in his hands. "I made this the winter she was carrying," he said, not looking up when he heard her step. "For the boy. Thought if I whittled at it enough evenings, it'd feel like something I was doing, waiting on him." He set it down careful on the mantel, the way a man sets down a thing he has carried too long to simply put away. Sarah never got to see it finished. Neither did he. Cora sat across from him and did not offer him comfort in words, because she had learned, in her own losses, that words offered too quickly only asked a grieving person to hurry past what deserved to be felt all the way through. She sat with him instead, quiet, until he spoke again on his own. "I keep waiting to feel like less of a stranger in my own house," he said. 2 years, and some mornings I still walk in expecting to hear her at the stove. "My father used to whistle mending harness of an evening," Cora said after a while. "Some fool tune he never got right. I haven't heard anyone whistle since he passed, and I still catch myself listening for it some nights, same as you're listening for her." She looked at him, steady. "Grief doesn't leave because we've decided we're through mourning, Beckett. It just makes room, eventually, for something else to sit beside it." "Is that what this is?" he asked. "Something else sitting beside it?" "I couldn't rightly say," she answered, though her heart was saying it plainly enough. "But I haven't stopped listening for your boots on the porch of an evening, if that tells you anything." He looked at her a long moment in the low firelight, and did not answer that directly, but he reached over and took her hand, and held it there between them without apology or explanation. And that, for the both of them, was answer enough. He had trouble of his own, trouble he hadn't burdened the stray woman in his storeroom with. The note on the ranch was held by Silas Vane, who ran the bank in Pawnee Bluff and had been buying up struggling spreads at auction prices for 3 years running, and who had made no secret that he'd have the Lyle place too, one way or another, before the year was out. Vane's daughter, Prudence, had taken to calling on Beckett with pies and soft words since Sarah's funeral, and Beckett understood plainly enough what marrying Prudence Vane would buy him time on the note, at the least, maybe forgiveness of it outright, and understood just as plainly that he could not make himself want it. The trouble came to his door on a Sunday, in the shape of Silas Vane's buggy and Vane's black coat, and Vane's flat banker's voice. "Word's gotten around town, Lyle," Vane said, not stepping down from the buggy, looking past Beckett to where Cora stood in the yard with a basket of wash. "A single woman living under your roof, unmarried, no kin to chaperone. Folks talk." "Folks always talk," Beckett said. "She works for her keep, nothing more to it. Doesn't matter what's true, matters what's said." Vane's eyes didn't leave Cora, weighing her the way he weighed collateral. "A man in your position can't afford talk. Notes due at the notes due date, Lyle, in 6 weeks' time, and a bank examiner looking for reasons to call it early might just find one in a scandal like this. There's no scandal in a roof over a hungry woman's head." "There's scandal in whatever I choose to call one," Vane said, mild as milk, and drove off before Beckett could answer that. Cora had heard enough of it standing in the yard, and that night, after the dishes were done and Emmett had gone to his bunk, she came to Beckett in the front room with her chin up in that same proud, breaking way she'd had on his porch step the first night. "I'll go," she said. "Come morning, I won't have you lose this place on my account." "You'll go nowhere in this cold with no place waiting," Beckett said, sharper than he meant to. "I've managed worse than cold." "That's not a thing to be proud of, Cora Ashford, and you know it." He hadn't meant to use her whole name like that, like it mattered to him how it sat in his mouth, and the saying of it seemed to surprise them both. He looked at his own hands a long moment. "I'm not turning you out over Silas Vane's notion of scandal. I'd sooner lose the note." "You'd lose your father's ranch." "I've already lost the things in it I couldn't stand to lose," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, carrying more of Sarah and the boy who never breathed than he'd said aloud to another living soul. Cora went still, understanding she was standing in ground too tender to walk on carelessly, and she did not press him further that night. But the trouble did not stay quiet. Within the week, word had gone round Pawnee Bluff sure enough. Mrs. Prout at the Mercantile saw to that, repeating what Vane had let slip to anyone who'd stand still to hear it, embroidering it a little more with every telling, until the tale bore small resemblance to the truth of a hungry woman and a dry storeroom. When Cora went into town for flour and salt, she found the counter women turned their backs, and Mrs. Prout herself made a show of counting out her change slow and pointed, as if handling stolen coin. "I'll not have decent women in my store made to stand next to her kind," Mrs. Prout said to no one and everyone, loud enough to carry to the back shelves. "Living under a man's roof unwed. In my day, a woman had shame enough to starve quiet rather than shame a whole town." Cora felt the blood rise in her face, but held her voice level. "I've done nothing in that house but earn my bread honestly, Mrs. Prout, same as you do behind that counter." "Honestly?" Mrs. Prout sniffed. "We'll see what's honest when the bank's through with Beckett Lyle." It was Ada Ainsley, the doctor's wife, who set her own basket down hard enough to rattle the counter jars and said, in a voice that carried twice as far as Mrs. Prout's, "I'd sooner stand beside a woman who rode into a blizzard to save a man's herd than beside anyone in this store still gossiping about her doing it. Shame on the lot of you." She took Cora's arm then, in front of the whole store, and walked her out onto the boardwalk herself, though her own flour order sat unpaid on the counter. "Don't let them see you cry over it," Ada told her quietly, once they were alone on the walk. "That's the only victory Prout wants." "I wasn't going to," Cora said, and found, gratefully, that it was true. She bore the rest of it the way she'd learned to bear all of it, spine straight, chin level, and finished her purchases and left before anyone could see her hands were shaking on the reins. She did not tell Beckett how bad it had gotten in town. She told him instead, 3 nights later, when Emmett came in from the north pasture white-faced and coughing, that the old man had a fever building and needed doctoring worse than any of them wanted to admit. There was worse news riding with him. Someone had cut the wire along the north fence line in 3 places, and near 40 head had wandered through the gaps and scattered along the creek breaks before Emmett found the damage and drove himself half-sick trying to patch it alone, rather than trouble Beckett with one more burden. "Vane's men," Emmett said, teeth chattering despite the blankets Cora piled over him. "Seen 2 riders off toward the Vane spread before dawn. Wire don't cut itself, Beckett." "You've no proof of that," Beckett said, though his jaw was tight enough to crack walnuts. "Don't need proof to know a snake's a snake." Emmett coughed until his eyes watered. "Man wants your land bad enough to call in a note early. He ain't above scattering your herd to make the ransoming easier." Beckett said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that would not curdle into a fight he couldn't yet afford to have, not with Emmett fevered and 40 head loose along the breaks, and the first hard cold of the season already breathing down the ridge line. The blizzard came down out of the north 2 days after that, faster and meaner than the almanac had promised, and it caught half the Lyle herd still scattered along the creek breaks with the first hard freeze of the year. Beckett was 3 miles out chasing cattle into the Box Canyon when the wind turned the snow to a wall. A man couldn't see his own hand through, and Emmett was too fevered to sit a horse, and there was no one left at the house but Cora to decide what came next. She could have stayed by the fire and told herself it wasn't her place to ride into a blizzard after a man who wasn't her husband, on a ranch that wasn't her home, for a life she'd only been borrowing 11 days. She thought of that, standing in the barn doorway with the wind screaming past her, and found she did not believe a word of it. She saddled the sturdiest horse in Beckett's string, wrapped every blanket she could carry over her coat, and rode out into the white with a lantern lashed to the saddle horn, because some things a person simply could not stand by and let happen, wanted or not, promised or not. The wind had teeth in it that cut through wool and hide alike, and twice on the ride out she lost the lantern's small circle of light entirely, guessing at the trail by memory and the mare's stubborn instinct alone. Somewhere off in the dark, a wolf, or a pack of them, called once, thin and hungry over the wind, and she gripped the reins tighter and rode on, because turning back now would have been its own kind of dying. She found him an hour later, dismounted, his horse gone lame in a snow-hid gopher hole, working half-frozen fingers to cut a heifer loose from a barbed tangle at the canyon mouth, while the storm tried to bury them both standing up. "You shouldn't have come," he shouted over the wind, and there was fear in it for her, not anger, though it sounded like both. "You'd have died out here arguing with yourself about whether to send for help," she shouted back, already down off her horse and working the wire with hands gone numb inside her gloves. "I wasn't going to sit by your fire and wonder." They got the heifer loose, and the rest of the strays bunched by the grace of the lantern, and a luck neither of them would later be able to properly account for, and they came back down off the ridge walking, leading both horses, because Beckett's mount could not be ridden and Cora would not leave him afoot in that wind. By the time the ranch house showed its light through the snow, they were near frozen through together, and something between them that had been circling for 11 days finally came all the way home. "You could have died out there," he said, inside, by the fire, working the cold out of her hands between both of his own, rougher than she was used to being touched and gentler than she'd been treated in longer than she could remember. "So could you," she said. "Seemed a poor reason to sit inside and let it happen." Cora, her name again, careful, like he was setting down something that might break. "I never asked what it cost you coming here that first night, begging shelter off a stranger. I should have." "It cost me the last of my pride," she said plainly, "and you gave it back to me the same evening, feeding me before you asked a single question. I haven't forgotten that. I've got nothing to offer you but a ranch a banker wants to take, and a name folks in town are dragging through the mud on my account. You've got a warm kitchen and an honest heart, Beckett Lyle, and I've gone hungrier for less than that." He didn't say anything more to her that night, only held her hands until the shaking stopped, but something had been decided between them in the snow that neither needed to put words to yet. Emmett's fever broke by morning, thanks to the willow bark tea and the mustard plaster Cora had learned from her own mother, and the herd was gathered in close enough to weather the rest of the storm, and for 3 days the ranch held its breath against the cold and came through whole. Silas Vane did not wait for spring to make his move. He came again inside the week, this time with a paper in his hand and 2 men from the bank flanking his buggy, and this time he did not stay outside the yard. "The examiners called the note early, Lyle," Vane said, stepping down at last, paper held out like a blade. "Effective today. You've got until Friday to satisfy it in full, or the bank takes the property at auction, same as any other." "You engineered this," Beckett said, low and even, the anger in him banked but not gone. "I offered you a way clear of it months ago," Vane said. "My prudence would still have you, note forgiven entire, if you'd only see reason and send that woman off your land." "That woman," Beckett said, and Cora, standing in the doorway with flour still on her hands, heard the whole yard go still around the words. Rode into a blizzard 2 nights past to pull me and half my herd off a canyon wall, Vane, while your daughter sat warm in town composing pie recipes. I'll take my chances with the auction before I trade Cora Ashford for a forgiven note. Vane's mouth thinned. Friday, Lyle. In full, or I sell this place out from under you same as I've sold 6 others this year. He drove off with his men, and the paper lay on the porch step where he'd let it fall, and Beckett stood looking at it a long moment before Cora came and stood beside him. I can't raise that kind of money by Friday, he said, quiet, the fight gone strangely out of his voice, replaced by something rower. Not selling every head I've got left. Then sell every head you've got left, Cora said. A ranch is planks and fence wire, Beckett. It isn't the thing worth keeping. It's my father's. Your father's not here to lose it. You are. And you've got more to hold on to than land. She took his cold hand in her chapped one, unashamed of the townsfolk who might be watching from the road, unashamed of anything anymore. I came to you with nothing, and you gave me a name to hide behind and a fire to sit at, and never once asked for anything back. I'm not leaving you to face Friday alone for the sake of Sela's Vane's paper. Friday came up cold and clear. The whole town of Pawnee Bluff turned out at the bank steps to watch, because Vane had made certain word got round that the Lyle place would go under the hammer if the note wasn't met. And there is no entertainment in a small town so reliable as another man's ruin. Beckett came into town with Emmett driving the wagon, and every dollar he could raise from the herd he'd sold at a loss to a buyer 3 towns over, and it was short. Everyone standing on that street, Prudence Vane included, watched the numbers get read out and come up short by near $200, and watched Sela's Vane's mouth curl toward the smile of a man about to collect. Mrs. Prout stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed, already composing the story she'd tell at the Mercantile the next morning, and even Ada Ainsley, come to town for the spectacle same as everyone else, had gone quiet and grim on Beckett's behalf. It was Cora who stepped up onto the bank steps then, in her one good dress, with the small tin box she had carried the whole 4 miles from the Bell House 11 weeks before, and had not once opened in Beckett's house, though he had wondered about it and never asked. Inside it was every dollar of her mother's egg money and burial savings that Mrs. Dunmore's nephew hadn't managed to steal from her before he'd cast her out money she had meant to keep against the day she might need to run again. The last hedge she owned against a world that had never once been kind to her. That's near $200, she said, setting it in Beckett's hands in front of the whole gathered town, in front of Vane's flat, furious stare and Prudence's pale, astonished one. It's not charity, Beckett Lyle. It's an investment in a home I mean to keep living in, if you'll have me. The street went silent enough to hear the wind in the awning canvas. You'd give me every cent you own, Beckett said, low only for her, though half the town strained to hear it anyway, to save a ranch that isn't even yours. It could be, Cora said, chin up, proud and unbroken and entirely unashamed in front of every person who had turned their back on her at the mercantile counter. If you ask me proper, instead of just letting me sleep in your storeroom out of pity. It was never pity, Beckett said, and there on the bank steps of Pawnee Bluff, with Sela's Vane's note satisfied in full and the whole doubting town for witness, he took both her flour-dusted hands in his. Cora Ashford, I've got a ranch, a warm kitchen and a fool heart that didn't know what it was missing till a half-starved, prideful woman near froze herself proving it to me. Marry me, not for shelter, not to spite Vane, because I can't rightly imagine the rest of my life with anybody else standing at that stove. She had come to him begging for nothing more than a corner to sleep in and food enough to see her through a bad season, asking for less than any person ought to have to ask for. She had not once, in all her hunger and all her walking, let herself hope for more than that. Yes, she said, and the whole street of Pawnee Bluff, gossips and bankers and all, heard her say it plain and clear and unashamed. Yes, Beckett Lyle, I'll marry you. Mrs. Prout, for all her sniffing, found nothing to say to that, and Ada Ainsley laughed outright, delighted, and was the first to step up and embrace the bride-to-be right there on the bank steps. Silas Vane folded his satisfied note back into his coat and drove off without another word, because there was nothing left in Pawnee Bluff for a man like him to buy that wasn't already spoken for. And Prudence Vane turned her buggy homeward and did not call at the Lyle Ranch again. They were married the following month, in the same front room where Cora had once stood dripping rainwater and begging for a barn to sleep in, with Emmett Sorrel standing up as witness, and the blue curtain still hanging bright in the kitchen window behind them. And if anyone in Pawnee Bluff still whispered about the woman who'd come from nowhere, they whispered it now with envy instead of scorn, because everyone could see plain as daylight that Beckett Lyle had never once, in all his life, looked at a woman the way he looked at his wife. And Cora, who had walked 4 miles in the rain with nothing left to her name but pride and a small tin box of egg money, understood at last, standing in the kitchen she had made her own, that she had not been given charity that first wet night after all. She had been given, quietly and without fanfare, exactly what she had never once let herself ask for: a home, a name, and a man who had seen her worth before she dared to see it herself.